Welcome to the last full session of this Galician marathon. We're going to have a round table, and the discussion today will be about religion and society in the history of Galicia. As you can see, the round table is not what we thought it was going to be half an hour ago. The person who remains from our original group is Professor Gerstenhundert, who has been introduced and spoken a number of times and I suppose needs no more introduction. To my right is Professor Israel Bartal, who also needs very little introduction in Jerusalem. And this is Andrei, turn your thing around so I can see your surname. Andrei Zayarnuk, who's also spoken, and he will be helping us out because otherwise we won't have a round table. The good news is we haven't got as long as we thought we had, so that's also good. Right. How this round table is going to work is as follows. I have prepared 3 questions for the participants. I'll read them out. They will choose to answer whichever parts of those they want in about 10 minutes each, and then we'll do a quick response, and then we'll open this up to discussion in the audience. Okay, so what are the 3 questions that I've written? These are they. So question 1. Thinking particularly of the period before the 20th century, how can we assess the importance of religion in a society where the term secular had little or no meaning? And if we want to narrow that down a little, to what extent is it possible to view religion independently from, say, ethnic, national or cultural identity in the history of Galicia? That's question 1. Question 2. How can we, or in fact should we even, distinguish between religion as a dynamic and a conservative force in Galician history, society? How different are the different religions of Galicia in this regard? We might open this issue up by considering not just the differences, but also the similarities in the religious cultures of the different groups in Galician society. And the third question is, we often view religion as little more than a source of tension or a flashpoint in Galician history. Is this what Salo Baron would have called a lachrymose conception? That is, one which warps our view of the past by prioritizing violent breaks over long-term continuities and acute outbursts of hostility over more general patterns of coexistence or even friendly relations. Those are the questions. The participants will respond to them as they see fit. 10 minutes each, since these 2 gentlemen are having to think of the answers as they go along. Gershon, the microphone's yours.
Okay, I just have a couple of things to say. I'm hoping that we will have a plenary discussion of some of these things. The first thing to say is where I live, that is chronologically, the confessional distinction is the main thing, and national distinctions come into being, you'll all debate, sometime in the 19th century, but they're much less important. Before that, what's distinctive about Galicia is there are multiple confessions, all sorts of religions. And you invoked Professor Baron. Professor Baron has a law. In the days when historians used to talk about historical laws, he had a law. And the law was that Jews fare better where they're not the only minority group. And here you have a case where there are multiple groups, and we would expect Jews to fare better than in a place where they're the only people who don't fit in to the society. And I think that's the case. I think it's the case for Galicia. I think it's the case for the Polish Commonwealth in general. Now, just because I said that national distinctions don't exist or aren't important before sometime in the 19th century, that hasn't stopped historians from writing about these things. And one case that I saw is the Congress of Polish Historians, when is this? 1995, had consecutive articles. In one, Jews are a religious minority, and in the next one, Jews are a national minority. And they both pertain to pre-partition Poland. So that's kind of the most basic point. if people disagree, it's fine with me. The second thing, though, is that we shouldn't assume the coherence of these groups. There can be profound divisions within these various confessional groups, and not only between them. And of course, the most dramatic case is the case of the anti-Talmudists who appeared in the middle of the 18th century. In any case, the study of this kind of thing ought to involve other kinds of cuts within the confessional divisions and between them, like class and region and gender and all that sort of thing. The other thing is that differences govern relations in different contexts. So that when a person who is a Catholic and a person who is a Jew meet, they don't necessarily meet as Jew and Catholic. They might meet as somebody who's trying to pick up somebody in a bar, in which case the confessional difference is probably not relevant, or they're both merchants at a tavern, or whatever it is. But the point is that these are not 100% determinative of the quality of relations between people. There's a kind of entanglement or multi-dimensionality of everyday life, which, of course, like everything else, would benefit from a gendered analysis. We had one paper about gender. I think there's a lot more that needs to be done in that area. I think religious difference matters in certain economic contexts more than in others. It's sometimes deeply important in an urban guild, but not so important when you're buying and selling textiles. So that's one kind of general point that I wanted to make. The second point is, I don't know what to call this, a kind of plaint. In the Jewish literature that I read of early modern East Central Europe, evidence of sympathy or empathy on the part of Jews for other people who are suffering is passingly rare. I have not found anything analogous to the remarkable passage at the beginning of Nathan Hanover's Abyss of Despair. I assume everybody in the room has read this. The remarkable passage at the beginning of Nathan Hanover's Abyss of Despair, in which he characterizes the suffering of Ukrainian peasants in language that he borrows directly from the book of Exodus that describes the suffering of the Israelites in Egypt, in a moment when those same Ukrainian peasants had slaughtered his family and lots of other people, as he describes in great and gory detail in the text of the book. It's a remarkable passage, and it's what made me think that that I hadn't ever seen anything like that. The people having compassion, Jews, at least the stuff that I know, I haven't seen anything like that elsewhere. And I wonder about lines of comparison of other groups, seeing the suffering of other people as also having some place in discussion. Now that's the second. And the third and last point I wanted to make has to do with religious conservatism and all of that. I've been saying this for a long time and never got anyone to take it up. But you know the story of Orthodoxy as told from Jacob Katz to Moshe Samet to Michael Silver, is that it constitutes an ideology that appears in the middle of the 19th century, substantially in reaction to religious reform movements in Central Europe, and it results in the slogan of this movement of freezing everything is that what is new is forbidden. Hadash asur min Torah. The thing that I want someone to do is to compare the Chatam Sofer and Pio Nono. Right? The Pius IX issued in 1860-something something called a Syllabus Errorum. It's a long, long list of errors made by people of his time. And I suspect that the rabbis of what we started, I don't know if we still call them ultra-Orthodox, the very conservative rabbis could sign off on a good many of those errors and say that they were equally discouraged. And it seems to me that this kind of general trend in the Catholic Church and among the Jews suggests that what happens, the formation of ultra-Orthodoxy is not just a reaction to moving the Sabbath to Sunday in Berlin or wherever the reformers were doing that, but it's part of a much broader trend in society. And I have one other question I would like to raise. And I once wrote a paper for Professor Kaminsky, and I said the rabbi had more influence over his community than the priest. And he said, how do you know that? And of course, I had no answer. And I still don't. So I'd really be interested to know who you think, if you compare, I'm all about comparing. I think it's what reveals things. So I'd be interested to know who has more influence and when does that influence wane? We know it definitely wanes in the 19th century. The value of a rabbi on the marriage market in 1850 was probably 10% of what he was in 1750. This influence wanes, and I suspect it wanes in both places, both groups, or all the groups, but I'd be interested to hear views about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Gershon. Israel Professor Bartal.
Well, instead of trying to respond separately to the three questions, I would like to make a kind of a general statement that would include everything I think on this in less than 5 minutes. And I have to admit, I have to admit that it's spontaneous because I was not supposed to respond. So you bear with me if it sounds sometimes, would sound sometimes kind of, not so well baked, so to speak. I think the starting point is something that happens all over Europe and also taking place in the central and eastern parts of Europe from the second half of the 18th century on, and this is the disintegration of the corporate system in a way that something that more or less enabled the coexistence, I'm not saying peaceful existence, but coexistence of several ethno-religious different groups, one next to the other, not as equal citizens, not as equal subjects, not as part of one unified system that requires something like equal rights and things like that. Rather, the corporation itself more or less enabled this kind of coexistence that was from time to time kind of shaked or had been shaked by crisis that had to do either with eruptions, if you like, of ethnic rivalries of all kinds, of mobilizing religious sentiments and religious creeds in kinds of local cases. And the 17th century case, of course, I think is an outstanding case due to the fact that what Professor Hundert alluded to was more or less something which changed an equilibrium that was not, I would say, ideal in the eyes of almost probably everyone of the minorities involved. However, at that case, when you read the text, for example, the language was a religious language. And the issue of converting the Jews, for example, was something that had to do with the issue of the sheer existence of communities in different parts of Eastern Europe, especially southeastern parts of Eastern Europe. So what happened in the 18th century is that this kind of corporative coexistence, and no wonder that some historians try hardly, and I would say almost desperately, to idealize it, like our colleague Andrzej Kamiński many years ago, to claim that the best time when Poland was Paradisum Judeorum, okay, paradise for the Jews, was in the corporate, if you like, commonwealth of pre-partition Poland. However, this coexistence actually shaped, sometimes overnight, with the political changes that made the relations between the corporations not based anymore just on the religious concept. Rather, it had to be co-opted into a new, sometimes even radically new, political system that required changing the nature of this identity. And hence comes the response to the other question. Actually, the place of religion in emerging nationalisms in Galicia, probably going back from, again, late 18th century on, was that the religious discourse had been mobilized and transformed into a nationalistic discourse. One way or the other, you have it in the Polish case, of course, you have it in the Ukrainian case, and you have it in the... It doesn't mean that the people regarded themselves as, I would say, religiously minded people anymore. The case of Jewish nationalism, of course, is, I think, the most telling. The most secularized Jews in Galicia, radical maskilim, Galician type, of mid-19th century, were highly critical in terms of Jewish conservative religion, so to speak. And they were being regarded as kind of blasphemous movements. However, their discourse was permeated with religious language. I don't have to mention the place of the Hebrew language, okay? So the idea of freeing nationalism, I mean the corporative element, separating ethnicity and religion, was kind of a, halfway process that never ended. Until today, by the way, in any nationalist movement. By the way, the most updated scholarship on nationalism goes back to the issue of the place of the religious discourse in nationalism. And I think the 21st century proves that something that some enlightened absolutists thought about in the 18th century hadn't worked in the 19th century. Now, to the issue of conservatism and radicalism in religion. Religion could work both ways, and I think that in the Jewish case, like in some other case, when you have, for example, millenarian or messianic religious movements, okay? Of course, they include, and everyone knows that from European history, from history of Islam, okay, that they are at the same time conservative and radical. They are constructive and destructive. They are promising new heaven and new earth. Shamayim chadashim ve'aretz chadasha. So is it radicalism? No doubt, by the way, that early socialists in general and early Jewish socialists and also Zionist socialists, when they looked back in Jewish history, they took, for example, the Torah as the source. For some of you it would sound strange, but for anyone who knows anything about the history of Zionist socialism, okay, they claim that the Torah is the basis of socialism, okay? It's something, and by the way, also anti-Semites claim the same thing, so probably this religious discourse penetrated well into all kinds of radicalisms that we don't usually identify with. Now, conservatism, for example, and Gershon has already alluded to that, If we take what I described in one of my studies as the alliance of conservatives in the Galician case, the Polish conservatism and Jewish orthodoxy, in terms of, and this is the last term I would like to throw into this discussion, and the phenomena of politicized religion, okay? This is a brand new modern phenomena. When I say politicized religion, it means that from starting with institutions in all ethnic groups, in all corporations, if you like, institutions, churches, if you like, Hasidic courts, okay, ended up in 50 years or in 100 years or in 150 years. Look at the Israeli parliament, by the way, of today. I think 20% of the constituency there is based on Hasidic and so-called Litvak parties that go back to the pre-World War I, if you like, multinational empires, and the discourse, I have to tell you something strange. 6 o'clock in the morning, I heard the headlines, the news describing the headlines of some Israeli newspapers, and one of the Haredi newspapers described today's Israeli government as a blasphemous government. I cite from my heart, from it by heart, a blasphemous government of Erev Rav. Somebody used this word before, and they are all actually members of the Efsektia. He's talking of our prime minister, who is a national religious person. Okay, so just go back to the second half of the 19th century and read texts of emerging Galician orthodoxy, okay? And you find it there. Politicized religion means also that even the most secular, the most radical groups, and some of them are kind of new incarnations of old corporations. I'm talking about political parties, Jewish political parties, but I have no doubt, and I know that something like this happened also with other political parties, with other minority groups elsewhere, specifically in Galicia. That means, for example, that I can claim that my ethnic group is the chosen group by God, but it doesn't mean that members of the party should follow any commandment or should believe in God. Can you imagine that? This is pure politicization of religion. So conservatism, actually, to sum up, in the case of Jewish orthodoxy, is something very, very interesting from the historical point of view. It was actually one of the best and most successful cases before 1931 to create coexistence or semi-coexistence with the other elements of society and with the changing regimes, either in a multi-ethnic empire, either in a nation state like the type of the interwar period. Look at the Agudas Yisrael in Poland in the interwar period, and you see how successful they were as the allies of the Polish, if you like, government or political system. So religion in Galicia was both radical and conservative. It was both destructive and constructive in terms of the existence of of old cooperative systems and old religious ethnic institutions. And the most interesting thing I have to say about religion is the way how historians and sociologists were so erroneous to mistake this fact up to the point that some of my teachers in this Hebrew University, especially historians of the socialist, Marxist camp, prophesied the end of religion. And for example, one of my great teachers, Professor Shmuel Ettinger, was more than sure that Hasidism would not survive the end of the 20th century. Can you imagine that in today's Israel and in today's Central and Western Europe?
Thank you very much, Professor Bartel. I think we can all agree that if we could all speak like that unprepared, we'd all be doing extremely well. Andre.
Okay, so religion as a way of life, ethnicity, ideology, everything. It seems to apply very well to the Ruthenian case, because basically in the first half of the 19th century, Ruthenians are defined through their confession. You know, the Greek Catholic Church, the Greek Catholic confession means to be Ruthenian. You have Greek Catholic priests, and in the 1830s at home, they speak Polish. They read Polish literature because you don't have secular Ruthenian literature. You know, the novels they like, they are available only in Polish. But they belong to the Ruthenian nation. And this changes in the second half of the 19th century. Right? So you have the emergence of the secular intelligentsia. All of a sudden, if you look at the political parties, the leadership, it's no longer priests. It's all lawyers, let's call them professionals, teachers, university professors. And the Polish case, I mean, my Polish colleagues will probably correct me, the Polish case is very different, right? I mean, there is famous Brian Porter's book about how open this Polish nation was at the beginning, where you have space for Greek Catholic Poles, you have space for Judaic Poles, and then you have this, you know, by the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, you have this, if not triumph, then kind of predominance of endetia version of the Polish identity, and those other options seem to disappear. But on the other hand, if you look at the Greek Catholic Church in the first half of the 19th century, it's a very recent invention. It's a Josephinian church. It's very different from the Uniate Church in the middle of the 18th century. They learn all kinds of new things in the seminary. There are subjects that, you know, priests in the 17th, most of the 18th century, never heard of. You know, pastoral theology, for example, how to talk to their parishioners, how to take care of them. So in a way, they are also very tolerant in the spirit of this enlightenment or absolutist enlightenment or enlightened absolutisms, toleration. So, for example, because I looked a little bit at the discourse in the 1840s, what they say about Jews, for example. So there are some hotheads, right, with kind of anti-Semitic rhetoric, but then you have people from the Greek Catholic hierarchy saying that, no, we should not think about Jews like that. And if we move forward, you know, to the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, yes, there is secularization, there are political parties, there are all kinds of Ukrainians who are no longer just Greek Catholics. You have other options, you know, they discovered that there are Roman Catholic Ukrainians, the so-called Latinniki, Roman Catholic peasants who speak Ukrainian, and they want to have them in the Ukrainian community. They actually want to have Jews as well, kind of Ukrainians of Judaic religion. The problem is that not many Jews want to join the Ukrainian community. Nevertheless, if you think about the leader of the Ukrainian community at the beginning of the 20th century, it's actually the Metropolitan. It's Andrei Sheptytsky. He is the most authoritative figure there. So in that sense, not much actually changed since the beginning of the 19th century. You still have the Prince of Church as the leader, informal leader of the national community. I think I'll stop here.
Thank you very much. Any of you want to, before I open it up to the audience? So respond at the end. Okay, so I'll now open it up to the audience. If you have any thoughts or comments on the issues that would have been raised, I'd like to stress Professor Hundert's thought about comparison, that we can understand phenomena of one group in comparison with those of other groups. It would be most enlightening. But whatever comments you have, Francois, I saw your hand. Rachel has a mic. Rachel. Sorry, I didn't see you. You were hiding behind David. Sorry. Now, please.
Yeah, so I want to add another element, if I may, to those you mentioned, and Andrei just mentioned toleration, which means in the Galician context or Habsburg context, religious toleration. There is also an intervention of the state in religion, especially marriage and divorce law. There is no civil marriage introduced. There is a civil procedure, but Galician must marry. There's I won't go into too many details, but one must marry by a priest or by a rabbi. Later, there's in case the church reject one of the couples, and also in the education of the clergy. And Andrei, you mentioned there's seminaries by Joseph II. There were only a limited number of. So I'm just wondering, how does that, the intervention of the state, how does that influence religion of the three denominations or whatever you want to call it? Because you have like a contradiction of religious toleration on the one hand, but then the government, you know, intervenes where it sees fit. Okay, that's.
I could start answering.
You want to answer?
So with the Greek Catholics, it's very simple. They are very grateful to the state for their intervention because not only you have all those educational opportunities, not just opportunities, actually requirements, right? And all of a sudden, priests are highly educated, the most educated people in the village. Also, their material well-being improved because of that. Yes, some monasteries were closed down. The religious fund was created. From that fund, you have salaries paid to priests because they are partly, basically, state employees now. And in the case of the Greek Catholics or Greek Catholic priests, it worked to their benefit. I mean, they are wealthier after those reforms than they were before. In the case of Roman Catholic priests, it's the opposite, I suspect. They complained. Their parishes were much larger than Greek Catholic parishes. They, I think they saw that their incomes before reforms were much better than after reforms, and I'm not sure about Judaism. Someone else.
Okay, it's very interesting to observe that out of the three partitioning powers, I think at the Austrian case, and later in the Austrian case, of course, intervened in all kinds of, if you like, religious matters due to the fact that they co-opted the minorities or the different groups into the state system, but they co-opted it in a way that was different, for example, from the Russian case. So I would like to draw attention to the fact that in Russia, the idea of establishing seminaries for state rabbis and kind of re-educating, creating a new cadre of rabbis who are supposed to be state officials, Kazioni Ravin called, okay? Later on, this is a whole story very different from the Galician case. However, in Galicia, if I remember correctly, and you correct me, of course, there was nothing like that. Although at the beginning, even in Maria Theresa's time, there was this idea of establishing a state rabbinate, and there was the Rabbi Bernstein, okay, who was the first state crown rabbi, okay, which was actually a continuation of something going back to absolutist system in other parts of the Habsburg Empire, like in Bohemia and Moravia. But this goes back to the 18th century. But there I hardly noticed kind of idea of preparing kind of a reform type, educated type, regenerated type of religious leaders, unlike the idea of the Russian case. By the way, both were taken from a French example, by the way, of the consistoire. So it's again something very interesting that doesn't involve only, specific ideas of Joseph II or just were limited to Joseph II. And one last comment about that is that in Galicia, we have to remember that the majority of the Jewish population, unlike the sources we have, we're usually concentrating on small numbers of educated people, of big cities people, of the so-called assimilationist group. But the majority of the population was Jewish population was very, very conservative, and actually the dominant power in most of the places was of the emerging local Hasidic courts. And this was something that worked more or less against anything that could make, I would say, kind of drastic intervention in religious life or in religious conduct.
Just a question. What would the panelists think about the impact of the relative proximity of the Ottoman Empire in the different periods of the existence of pre-partition Galician territories and later? It's a different.
Ottoman Empire when 18th century. This is something
before.
I studied, by the way, so I can.
Well, I know that there's expertise on the panel.
What period specifically? Because there is a gap between 18th century Ottoman Empire and the Ottoman reforms, which were kind of semi-European in a way, in the 19th century.
Well, you choose the century.
Okay, so one of the models that was emulated by the Ottoman reforms, they had to do, first of all, I'm talking about two major reforms that had to do with religion and Jewish religious leadership. And we are talking about something that scholars have been debating for almost a century. Was there something called Chacham Bashe, the chief rabbi? Oh, it was, sorry?
Go.
A chief rabbi who was actually a state official and was nominated by the state, and actually the first Chacham Bashe, the chief rabbi, Chacham, by the way, in Turkish and in Arabic is the rabbi, the parallel to the Ashkenazi rabbi. Chacham Bashe in Jerusalem in 1840, Chaim Avram Gagin, got his nomination from the Sultan officially, and he was an official state, if you like, part of the state system, like the Armenian head of the church, like the Greek Orthodox, and actually the Chacham Bashe of the empire in Istanbul, okay, was similar in status, in honorifics, by the way, to all leaders of other religious minorities. But this is something that starts from the so-called Khati Sharif, the reform of 1839 in Turkey. After 1856, there was another wave of reforms that made actually non-Muslim religions equal in the status, in the civic status. But still, they were regarded as taifa, in Arabic means a religious community, okay? And the rabbis, the chief rabbis, had also all kinds of civic functions other than religious. I'm not going to elaborate on the whole story, but to cut a long story short, the kind of semi-autonomy in a non-democratic system in the Ottoman Empire existed also for the Jews, but for all other groups, including the Armenians, okay? I deliberately put it like this, okay? Until the end of the empire in 1918.
Okay, so in case of the Christians of Eastern Rite, this Ottoman connection, in my opinion, was very important for Orthodox, and of course Lviv and Przemysl and Galicia, or Ruthenian Galicia in general, became uniate actually quite late, right? So territories to the east, closer to the Dnipro River, became uniate sooner than Galicia proper, or the territory that would become Galicia at the end of the 18th century. So for the Orthodox community of Lviv, the Ottoman connection was very important because you have Orthodox princes of Wallachia and Moldavia, and they are the richest benefactors of the local Orthodox community. If you go to Lviv, you know, the most beautiful church from this early modern period is called Voloska, which is basically Wallachian church. You'll see, you know, the coat of arms of the Wallachian prince there. The richest merchant of Lviv at that time is also of Wallachian background, of the Wallachian origin. And once they become unite, this no longer as important. It's no longer important in the 18th century. And of course, the Orthodox of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in the 18th century now have a different main benefactor, right? The Russian emperors, or mostly empresses in the 18th century.
But let me just add something that a response to our question related to the Greek Orthodox case. You probably remember that the emergence of nationalism or nationalistic movements in southeastern Europe, south to Ukraine, including today's Romania and today's Bulgaria, had to do with Greek Orthodox priesthood that was connected with the Greek, ethnic Greeks, so-called, okay, of the 19th century. And emerging Greek nationalism actually was kind of pan-Hellenic in the way that it spread also well into the southern parts of the Russian Empire, including Odessa, by the way. So it's highly complex, and it's very important to observe that you see here nationalism used also the institutional church basis in a similar way that you can find sometimes with some pre-modern Jewish corporation that more or less transformed in a very strange manner into early nationalistic foci of identity, so to speak.
Please.
Another dimension of this, and this is the case for Poles and for Jews, is that the profound cultural influence that flows back and forth between the Ottoman Empire and the lands of the Commonwealth. I mean, I once made a list of the best-selling books among Jews in the 18th century, a bestseller list based on frequency of republication and leaving out the canonical books. And I think number one was a book written and published in Constantinople called Shevet Musar, which is a collection of maybe Sabbatian, maybe not, Kabbalistic material that percolates into the sermons of rabbis all over the place in Poland, Lithuania. And that it's really, I think, analogous to the influence of Ottoman cultural production and so on in general in the population of Poland, Lithuania, the hairstyles and the textiles and the rest of it. So there is a lively, we sometimes forget how close by the Ottoman territories were, and they are part of the picture if you're trying to recover the cultural life of this region.
We never forget that due to the fact that Sabbatian movement actually was a movement, and also the Frankist movement, was a movement that was closely connected to Sephardic communities in the Ottoman Empire on the other side of the border, but also have in mind, some people would not remember it probably, but Podillia, okay, was for 30 years a sanjak in the Ottoman Empire between, now correct my dates, 66 to 99, not 70, 1666 to 76, okay, for 30 years. And I happened to read the doctoral thesis in Polish written many years ago on the archival documents on this, and it's amazing because actually you see kind of interference of the Ottoman presence, okay? And the documents are found in Constantinople archive, in Istanbul, okay? Anyway.
Yeah, please.
Thank you very much. If I might come back to 19th century and to Galicia. And my first point is that I was really very happy to hear Professor Hundert and Professor Bartal to mentioning Andrzej Kamiński. I belong to informal club of admirers of Andrzej Kamiński, and although I also have doubts about his idealization of early modern Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, but I enjoy it very much. And seriously, I'm have to say that if ever I had an experience in professional humility, it's here, because I came to Israel on Sunday believing I am sort of specialist on Galician history. And 2 days were enough to convince me of mistake of my judgment about myself, and therefore I'm really unable seriously to make this appeal, to take this appeal that Professor Hundred made about comparative history. But I would like to say something about Christian, at least about Christian denominations in Galicia, leaving it open whether it fits, so to say, the Jewish religion. And the first point I would like to make is that I personally do not very much believe in the thesis of secularization in 19th century. There was this famous paper by Olaf Blaszke, Zweite Konfessionelle Jahrhundert, Second Confessional Century, about 19th century, published some 20 years ago. And although we can debate how far 20th century secularization trends do have their roots in 19th century, it's another matter. Still, 19th century is a period of blossoming of religions and religious feelings. It is rarely noticed. Actually, one of my colleagues I didn't invent it myself, one of my colleagues turned my attention to the fact that 19th century compulsory secular school, so main agent of modernization, was also main agent of religious instruction, because 19th century secular school does have, whose curricula are invented not by churches but by the Ministry for Kultus und Unterricht, they have religious classes. This is the first time in religious history that religious instruction reaches everybody in 19th century. So at the time, among high elites, we have fashionable anti-religious trends with Renan and whomever stronger and stronger from 19th century. At the same time, on the mass level of society, probably people are more religious than any time before. How far we can measure it? What does it mean that people are religious? It's another story. I leave it aside. And I certainly absolutely agree with what Professor Bartal said about this double face of religions as both conservative and progressive. There is this, I think that Shmuel Eisenstadt's thesis of multiple modernities is very, very pertinent. In this case, one could add that not only Torah for Jewish socialists, but also the gospel for many Christian socialists in 19th century, non-Marxian, was seen as origin of socialist ideas, and the catchword Jesus Christ was the first socialist was quite often repeated, not in Orthodox Catholicism, but in many heterodox Christian religious groupings. At the same time, I would like to add one more dimension. I believe, however you call it, that religion is religion is a force in its own right. It is not a proxy for nationalism. It is not a proxy for traditionalist identity. It's not a proxy for political grouping. However important the political religion is that you mentioned, it is also about, I would say, many people do have a sort of internal striving for metaphysics. Not everybody, but many people have. And religion, in a sense, fulfills it, better or worse as it can. And I believe so that historians should not tend to somehow mentally instrumentalize a religion as a tool to some other aims. Many times it was, but not always. And for early 20th century, and it will be my question, because in early 20th century we have Catholic modernism. Catholic modernism, which was later condemned by Pope Pius X in the encyclical Pascendi in 1907. Catholic modernism, which is very much about individualization of religion, yes, about immanency, yes, inner drive for religious feeling, not institutionalizing, but inner drive for religious feeling, and it is quite strong and fashionable among many intellectuals and theologians in early 20th century. I think this should be seen, this should be taken into consideration together with this parallel, not against, but together with this idea of politicized religion. And I would be quite also curious to know whether there was some analogy or some influence of this Catholic modernism also among the in the Jewish religion. Thank you very much.
Further questions?
Yeah, I can't say anything about Jewish modernism, but I agree with you. The 19th century is also the century of Christianization. Many historians of, Orthodox Christianity would argue the official church is concerned about this folk religion, popular religion, and the gap between kind of official doctrine of the church and folk beliefs. And I think the gap is reduced, by the end of the 19th century, early 20th century. Early 20th century, you have missions, you have kind of religious revival, which is purely religious, not actually connected to political movement, nationalization, and so on. If you look at the circulation of Apocrypha, Franco is recording them because they are disappearing. They are becoming, rarer. It's clear for people that this is not, the sanctioned religion. Letters from heaven, about which I wrote.
You borrowed the title from Vincent's.
They were called letters from heaven back in the 19th century. Yeah.
Paradoxically enough, the most so-called conservative movement in Jewish history, and specifically in this case in Galicia, was of course Hasidism. Please bear in mind that we have an imagined history of Hasidism and real history of Hasidism. Real history of Hasidism is a 19th century phenomena. It's not an 18th century phenomena. Because in the 18th century, it was a small, relatively small group, different groups that became kind of a mass religious movement, the largest in Jewish history ever, okay, and spread all over partitioned Poland. It is across political borders, and by the way, survived all reforms in terms of continuity, okay, and actually developed also all kinds of revivalist, internal Jewish, if you like, theological currents that some of them we're still studying now. So in that regard, against all kind of, outdated historiography of Jewish religion, bear in mind that this most, if you like, conservative and most so-called archaic is a phenomena that became only in the 19th century a powerful, influential religious fact. But now I would like to throw on something else. Also, it's not only, let us not limit ourselves to the issue of Jewish orthodoxy. Because, by the way, Hasidism is one thing and orthodoxy is another thing. It's another story. The transfer of, or transformation of Hasidism into orthodoxy was a belated stage and also something that has to still to be studied carefully. However, there were other religious Jewish movements due to all kinds of internal political Israeli and Jewish, if you like, disagreements, mostly political, by the way, not religious, I think. There were other two major religious Jewish movements in Central and Western Europe that for some reasons had little impact on Central and Eastern Europe and also in Galicia, with the exception of in the big cities, and I'm talking about Jewish reform. To give also the credit to a religious movement, okay? That claim, by the way, that Jewish identity is not nationalist until a certain period, okay? And this was a religious creation of the 19th century. So I think that what you say here is also true for the Jewish case and forget about the internal Jewish disagreement, what is religious and what, if someone doesn't believe the way you believe, he is non-religious. Because this is a typical Jewish discourse, coming from Galicia, by the way.
I'm going to, yeah, 1 minute. Oh, Francois, please.
Very good question. Like the one before. What would the panel say about the impact of the two universities, Krakow and Lviv, on the various communities? Let's say in the 19th century and early 20th century. The fact that you have two large, very well-established universities in Galicia, what is the impact of these institutions of higher learning?
I wrote an article on that.
Well, off you go then.
In my next live, I will find a question where Israel Baital has not written an article in response to beforehand.
Francois, I have an article that is also available in English on Jews and higher education in Eastern Europe in the 19th century. But I can sum it up in one line. It had an enormous impact on Jewish modernism in many ways. By the way, for just one example, modern Jewish historiography, okay? I mean the Polish one, by the way, the so-called Polish one, not the Russian one, but also indirectly the so-called Russian one. Okay, you know, Jewish historiography was imperial-minded, but that's another story. And have in mind the big names of interwar period Jewish historians were mostly, I think, almost exclusively coming from Galicia, and they were educated in one of the two universities.
Some of them were educated in Vienna, because I think there are
Yeah,
three
Vienna
universities.
is a wing of Lemberg, as you know.
Okay.
It was. I'm not joking.
And in the Greek Catholic, Roman Catholic case, seminaries are actually integrated into the university. So the faculty of theology is basically, to become a priest, you have to obtain this university education. You go through the university education, you basically get a university degree. The only difference is that you have to, live in your separate dorm in the seminary and take most classes there.
I was going to add one thought, perhaps two. If you look at the very earliest phase of Hasidism, the 18th century Hasidism, when it's in its missionary phase, you can see very interesting parallels between structures of power in non-Jewish society and the way in which Hasidism shaped itself in order to win adherents across Galicia and Ukraine. I haven't seen parallel work done on the history of popular religion in the 19th century, because there is a Polish now school of study of Hasidism, which is very much a social history school and a school of Hasidism as lived experience. And I would love to see the research which tries to understand whether popular religion, the folk religion, actually the structures, the ways of thinking and the ways of acting and celebrating and the rituals, do they in fact cross borders between the religions or not? Or in what case, to what extent do they do that? That's what we're talking about, this question of the importance of understanding the comparative aspect. We've talked a lot in this conference about Galicia, but everyone is talking about their own Galicia. I think Larry at the very beginning gave us a wonderful overview of everyone's Galicia, right? But nonetheless, it's very much been everyone's Galicia. And the question, I think, remains open: was there something above everyone's Galicia? And if so, what was it? Larry, then Michael.
So, obviously, the thing that is above everyone's Galicia is the imperial dynasty, but that's self-evident. What I was going to suggest was something else. That we've talked about everyone's Galicia in a variety of separate cases. One of the things that to me is very striking about Galicia is the ways in which these pieces are interlocking. It came up a little bit with the discussion of anti-Semitism earlier with reference to Franco. Anti-Semitism is, of course, a subject with a long, interesting history all of its own in Europe. If you look at it in its Galician context, one of the things that's rather striking about it is the ways that it fits into a set of patterned animosities that exist among three different groups, moving in a variety of reciprocal ways, which is not to say that anti-Semitism doesn't also have its own separate history, but what I would be interested in here is the ways in which you have an almost structural Levi-Straussian set of triplex relations, complicated by the fact, which as your panel has partly suggested, you can almost map onto the three nations, three religious groups. I say almost because within each of those groups there would at least be a significant subgroup that resisted the mapping of religion onto the national identity. And if I were thinking about what holds Galicia together conceptually, what I'd be looking at would be the structural pattern of what I think we could call Wahlverwandtschaften, in which we have a set of tensions, but a set of tensions that are also, as we've talked about this as well, balanced by a set of sympathies and even tactical alliances, and that if we were thinking about the patterning of the way those pieces work, we would be looking at something that was structurally Galician. And it perhaps comes back to something that Gershon said at the very beginning, the situation of the Jews in which they're not the only minority. And it's as I say, the triple nature of this particular problem that I think is particularly fascinating and particularly Galician.
Thank you. Michael, and then we'll round up and we're done for the day.
Just apropos the popular religion, two things. Of course, visiting the graves of tzaddikim, which I think, at least I know the situation in Hungary where non-Jews would come and put, there would be a Jewish sort of caretaker who would write down their requests to the various rabbis because apparently they didn't understand maybe Magyar or something like that, something I would like to have. My wife is barren, I would like to have a child, I would like to have, be able to have a large fish, sort of fishing should be successful. I should learn how to dance the chardash, things like that were usually put into these ptakim. So you have that. But there's another thing which is mentioned, by the way, which I think Richie Cohn has not mentioned, and that's the portraits of rabbis. There is an opposition also to portraits of rabbis. And one of them says, of course, we know where these portraits of rabbis sort of phenomenon comes from. And the idea is, of course, are portraits of saints. And it's one of the reasons that you were one. But the same people who are selling the portraits of saints were the ones who were also selling the portraits of rabbis. So you have this type of popular religion. I would just like to mention one thing which I think is interesting. I've always been very much impressed by the fact that over the course of the 19th century, the various juries that we know developed their own sort of sense of identity, almost in a sort of an isolated sort of sense. This I know with Hungary, and this I know with Lithuania. I don't know of any Lithuanian rabbi who even knows the names of the Hungarian rabbis, with the exception of the Khatam Sofer. And I think it's pretty much mutual as far as the Hungarians go. They know maybe the Vilna Gaon, but that's about it. There is a sort of insularity that begins to develop in the 19th century. Polish Jewry is probably the least of this type, but even then, you can sense that there is a special type of culture that begins to develop in each of the various groups, including in Galicia. Galician, for instance, Galician rabbis are known for their expertise as in responsa literature, something that the Lithuanians absolutely not. You have this sort of sense of developing of a certain type of national character. This is certainly true of the Litvaks. It's certainly true of the Hungarians. And to some extent, I think it's also true of the Galicianos. And I think that part of it has to do with this enormous demographic explosion. Galicia at the end of the 18th century is maybe 200,000. At the beginning of the 20th century, we were talking about 1 million. I think there's a sort of a self-containment that takes place in the various juries, which enhances this sort of sense that, you know, who we are. And I think they really sort of within themselves. Very rarely do you have things that go beyond. And this is true, of course, of the Hasidic dynasties, where the borders are quite clear of where, with very few exceptions, of where the Hasidic courts, each Hasidic court has its borders. We know that Belz is eastern Galicia. We know that Vizhnitz overlaps in Żydychów a little bit. We know that the west is maybe Tzanz and stuff like that. Ger is Congress Poland. You know, we know more or less the mapping of these type of these situations. I think it also has to do with this sort of democratic explosion. But maybe Benny has something to say.
Between Galicia and Hungary, there were close ties and familiarity, cross familiarity of both on both sides, and also in the response area, they quote one another and they're really exposed to one another's culture.
So, last comment, then we'll go to Omer Bartol.
I have a couple of quick questions to the panel that sort of, I thought of them when I was listening to Larry's comment just now. The first is, what do you think, and I don't think we spoke much about it during these 2 days, what do you think was the effect of emancipation, of the peasants' emancipation and of the Jewish emancipation on relations between the groups in Galicia in the latter part of the 19th century and beyond? And the second is, and that's a sort of bigger question that I've been trying to think about during these 2 days. We know, of course, that between 1914 and 1945, Galicia is an area in which there's a great deal of violence, and much of that violence is interethnic. How do we place that within the context of what we've been talking about here regarding the 19th century and before? Do we say that this is really a product of World War I and everything that followed? Or can we identify roots of that massive fraternal violence that occurs in those lands between 1914 and 1945, 6, 7, more or less? Thank you.
We'll take the opportunity for the panel to respond to what Professor Bartol asked and sum up your feelings about what we've been talking about. You want to start, Andrei?
We talked with Omer about that during the coffee break, so I actually gave you my answer. Essentially, for me, contingencies are more important than continuities in this particular case. So before World War I think there were all kinds of other options still open, and it's only World War I and the wars that followed that changed the situation drastically. And to go back to Larry Wolf's comment about this triangle, which is not just a simple triangle but something more complex, I agree completely. I think this is something we sometimes forget. So there is this Galicia created by the empire, right? Empire draws boundaries, imposes certain framework, changes even the kind of physical space of the province in a way, right? Through land surveys, taxation, and so on and so on. But there is also this internal logic of the relationships between those groups that we've mentioned. And if you cross the border, you know, you cross this bridge, you still have the same ingredients, seemingly. You have Ukrainian peasants, you have Jews in more or less the same proportion, you have Polish landlords, but the dynamic is completely different. And when you have Russian travelers or Ukrainian travelers coming from the Russian Empire or Jewish travelers, they recognize it immediately. Galicia is a different world for them at the beginning of the 20th century. So yeah, I think we should just explore this more.
Regarding the issue of violence, it was not something that was limited only to Galicia. It's something that took place at the emergence of the empires, of the disintegrating empires. Let me add to this, you can draw a line from southeastern Russian Empire, the borderline with the Ottoman Empire, and check what happens there between like 1890 to 1918, and then from 1919, okay, to the mid-20s, and then as another wave, much more violent, in the late 30s and 40s. I think that this is part of a much broader phenomena of global disintegration of the imperial powers and the way how the ethnic or ethno-religious groups that for some reasons organized and were mobilized around ideas of separate nation states created this kind of eruption. But it had to do first and foremost with the removal of a centralized power that could dominate it even militarily. And I think that in the long run, you have to go forward and to see what happens in today's Ukraine, for example, as just another wave of this process that has been never ended from the second half of the 19th century.
Yes.
This is too late for me.
Okay. Larry, then we'll wrap.
Just one note. I wanted to pick up on what Omar said about violence and what Israel Bartol followed up on. And I was just wondering whether there are people in the room who have, reasonable countable numbers on the violence, because I'm not sure that in terms of body count, it's going to turn out to be enormously high for Galicia across the 19th century. I don't know whether you count the Napoleonic Wars.
20th century.
Oh, you're talking for the 20th century. Okay, so you agree, right? We would agree that for Galicia, the relative amount of violence is probably small compared to the later 20th. Pardon?
Lesser than in Chicago.
Yeah. Okay. Got it.
Violence is today much more interesting than emancipation, probably. I hate to say that.
Okay, the topic. Yeah, really. Emancipation we can discuss over coffee. I want to thank our panel, Andrei, Israel, Gershon. Thank you for your participation.